Welcome to Books and Bridges, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We continue our discussion series on treasures of world literature. Tonight, we will examine the crossroads between the Enlightenment and Romanticism, and how the poetry of William Wordsworth was able to bring the sacred into the secular. Books and Bridges is a public humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We examine the wisdoms of the world and apply them to modern life. And let me thank Utah Humanities for funding this event. I'm your host, Nathan Nielsen, and we are privileged enough and fortunate enough to have Terryl Givens as our guest tonight. Let me just read you his bio. Dr. Givens was born in upstate New York, raised in the American Southwest, and did graduate work in intellectual history at Cornell and comparative literature, a doctorate at UNC Chapel Hill, working with Greek, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and English languages and literatures. As professor of literature and religion, and the job as a Bostwick professor of English at the University of Richmond, he taught courses in Romanticism, 19th century cultural studies, and the Bible and literature. Currently, he is a Neil A. Maxwell Senior Fellow at Brigham Young University. He has published in literary theory, British and European Romanticism, Mormon studies, and intellectual history. The New York Times has praised him for his provocative writing, and Harper's has called him, quote, fair-minded, scholarly, and unbiased, unquote. So we have a great guest and a great treat before us tonight. I will turn the time over to you, Terryl. Let me just make one note before I do that, and that is, with Terrell's permission, all of you viewers, feel free to ask questions, submit questions through the Q&A button throughout the presentation. If you have questions, if you have an insight, and we can get to those questions as in the course of things tonight. So, Terryl, why don't you go ahead, and we are all ears.
All right, thank you. Is the visual up and working?
Yes, it looks great.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. It's a pleasure for me to be able to talk about Romanticism. I haven't been doing that much since I retired from University of Richmond and came here to Brigham Young University. But tonight I'm going to be talking about Wordsworth and a reconfigured sacred. And just to emphasize what Nathan just said about questions, if you want to hold your questions to the end, that will be fine. But if you want clarification for something I'm in the process of describing or discussing, then don't hesitate to send a quick chat to Nathan, and he can arrest the progress of my presentation long enough for me to make whatever clarifications would be helpful. So let me explain a little bit about what I have in mind tonight. It's a fairly ambitious presentation that I've prepared, and so I will probably be speaking rather quickly and moving kind of expeditiously, because I really want to set the stage to explain what the challenge is that Wordsworth is facing as a poet of the secular sublime. And so I'm going to kind of do a quick overview of religious history in the West for the last 2,000 years. So let's see if that works by way of setting the stage. So it's going to be of necessity brief and a little oversimplified. You might know that the I created a kind of subtitle for those. There we go. Let's try that again. For those less than fully academically inclined, a simpler way of talking about my subject tonight is to say, I'm going to talk about how it became possible to say I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, which is a fairly common mantra among the younger people of the 21st century, especially. So let's start with the beginning of the Christian tradition, rooted in Judeo-Christian past. When we turn to the book of Genesis and look at the way in which God is portrayed, there's no question that there is a very simple, unproblematic, anthropomorphic depiction of God. They heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. It's pretty much a given in early Jewish studies that this conception of God as an embodied being was, if not universal, frequent. And with the birth of Christianity, we are only a few centuries into the development of the tradition before we begin to see some fairly drastic changes. And I think these first become evident with the development of the creeds in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. These excerpts are taken from the Athanasian Creed. But what I want you to do with me as I go through these first slides is to try to keep in your mind a kind of sense of a radical discontinuity between the kind of God depicted in this art, as well as the verses in Genesis, and what we get with the development of a kind of Greek-influenced theological tradition evident in creedal Christianity, where God is defined as the Father incomprehensible, the Son incomprehensible, the Holy Spirit incomprehensible, the Father eternal, Son eternal, Holy Spirit eternal, and yet not three eternals, but one eternal. The Son is of the Father alone, not made nor created, but begotten, a distinction that wouldn't make sense anywhere outside of this particular creedal context, who, although he is God and man, yet he is not two, but one Christ, one altogether, not by confusion of substance, but by unity of person, and so forth. And we find the same kind of tendency in most of the creedal formulations of the medieval period, a kind of emphasis on the impossibility of capturing God in familiar language or familiar categories. I think it's really significant that my personal favorite theologian, Kenneth Kirk, he was an Anglican bishop of London in the mid-20th century. He refers to that great and tragic accident of Christian thought. Now, what is this great and tragic accident that he thinks sets the entirety of Christian theology on a new trajectory? Well, he dates it to this very same period of the 5th century, and he takes as most typical, perhaps, of the development that he's talking about, the Pseudo-Dionysius. And I'm going to have trouble reading some of my slides because I see that I've got some pictures up there in the corner of, it is neither soul nor intellect, nor has it imagination, opinion, reason or unreason. Neither can it be expressed or conceived, neither is it standing nor moving. It doesn't have power, nor is it power, nor is it light. It's not one or oneness. It's not Godhead or goodness, nor anything else known to us or to any other beings and things that are, or the things that are not. Neither does anything know that, neither does anything that is know it as it is. Neither can the reason attain to it, nor name it, nor know it, and so forth. This has been called by some writers like Evelyn Underhill the greatest, most profound definition of God ever devised. But once again, I'd ask you to just cast your mind back to that initial slide, and we might ask the question, what exactly has happened here? What is going on? Well, in the words of Friedrich Nietzsche, his characterization of these developments are that Christians have come to worship the question mark itself. And he attributes this to what he calls the habit of admiring the unintelligible. I would like a couple of hours to make this argument in greater detail and at greater length, but simply put, my thesis in this regard is that there is something perhaps inherent in human nature. William James, as we'll see in a moment, thought that it was a characteristic of human nature that craves the ineffable, the transcendent, the mysterious, the unutterable. And so increasingly, as Christianity develops through the centuries, we find that it tilts more and more and more in the direction of associating the divine with mystery, with the ineffable. And Rudolf Otto, one of the preeminent theologians of the 20th century, I think put it in really quite memorable terms. He refers to this mysterium tremendum, right? This stupendous mystery. He says it's not merely an attribute of divinity, but the deepest and most fundamental element in all religious devotion. It is something beyond conception or understanding, extraordinary and unfamiliar, before which we therefore recoil in a wonder that strikes us chill and numb. Now, my own sense as a student of historical theology is that this is a point quite far removed not just from the anthropomorphic conceptions of God that we find in the early Judeo-Christian traditions, but certainly quite far removed from anything we see in the New Testament. I don't see anything in Paul or the other writers that situates the mysterium tremendum at the heart of what it means to have Christian experience of God. Elizabeth Johnson is a contemporary feminist critic, and she simply reaffirms this same trajectory. The history of theology, she says, is replete with this truth. She traces it back to Augustine, who said, if we have understood, then what we've understood is not God. Anselm, who said, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Hildegard's vision of God's glory is living light that blinded her sight. Aquinas's working rule that we can know that God is and what God is not, but not what God is. Luther's stress on the hiddenness of God's glory, Simone Weil's conviction that there is nothing that resembles what she can conceive of when she says the word God. And Sally McFaig's insistence on imaginative leaps into metaphor, since no language about God is adequate and all of it is improper. So what all of these critics are saying, and what I'm affirming, is that the experience of God comes to be virtually indistinguishable from the experience of incomprehensibility itself. We bow in utter helplessness and incomprehension in the face of this ineffable, transcendent, inexpressible something. And all of this kind of comes crashing down when the Enlightenment attains a kind of ideological supremacy, late 17th and throughout the 18th century. And if I could give just a kind of one slide summation of the Enlightenment, it might best have been said by Christopher Hitchens, who said, given the emergence of the telescope and the microscope, religion no longer offers an explanation of anything important. Now, Hitchens says this as a new atheist and cheers the development of the Enlightenment and the decline of conventional religiosity, but it's also a fairly accurate summation in terms of intellectual history of what the Enlightenment represented in terms of its challenge to a prevailing kind of Christian or religious sensibility in the West. So when we talk about the Enlightenment, we're talking about the 18th century, essentially, the eve of Romanticism. I love this statement by Samuel Johnson because I think that it represents a kind of one sentence summation of the whole concept of the religious sublime turned inside out. Instead of seeing mystery and wonder and the sublime as the essence of God and divinity, he says wonder is simply the effect of novelty upon ignorance. So again, a statement that is typical of Johnson's acerbic wit, but it also captures very nicely, I think, the kind of prevailing spirit of the philosophe who dominated Enlightenment thinking and writing. So if we take that as the kind of state of affairs as we reach the end of the 18th century, then the next major development is going to be what I call the Romantic strike back. And so this is, of course, a little bit of a reductionist approach, but given the time constraints, I'm going to beg your indulgence. Romanticism is much more complex and interesting as an aesthetic and philosophical phenomenon than to be reduced to a simple reaction against Enlightenment rationalism. But I think that we can, it would not be inaccurate to say that one of the prime engines of Romantic aesthetic development is a felt need, or maybe a subconscious need, to find some way to recapture, to rearticulate the function that the sacred served in the absence of institutional religion and conventional affirmations of creedal thought. and creedal belief. So that's kind of the task that in many ways Romanticism sets for itself. It's not just that we have lost the prestige and the influence of Christianity as a major force in Western civilization, but that at the more personal level, there is this felt vacuum that adoration of mystery and sublimity provided. And so that is, I think, the proper context in which to understand Wordsworth and the mission that he kind of assigns to himself. One last comment here that I think captures perfectly the psychology that underlies my approach, at least, from the American philosopher William James. He said, "For many humans, richness is the supreme imaginative requirement. The inner need is for something complex, majestic in the hierarchic interrelatedness of its parts, with authority descending from stage to stage, and at every stage, objects for adjectives of mystery and splendor." So I want you to just focus on that last phrase, what William James is saying. And in his case, this is his explanation for the prevalence of religion in all cultures, in all times, in all ages. He thinks that there is just something deeply rooted in the human soul that craves something to worship. And it doesn't have to be embodied in the form of a god. It just has to be something to which we can attach adjectives of mystery and splendor. So you can see that he has, with this formulation, kind of provided a rationale for what I see as the substitution of a religious sublime with a secular sublime. As long as that sublime aspect of the thing we're adoring persists. We want something to fall down and worship or be amazed by or feel reverence toward. So Wordsworth's personal project then is to satisfy this human craving for the sacred, but to do it in a language, in a vocabulary divested of conventional religious categories and religious authority. So one last kind of prefatory comment. I personally, as a scholar of Romanticism, date the paradigm shift that is going to introduce Romanticism to 1757 for this reason. Rationalism was predicated, and rationalism, of course, the precursor of Enlightenment thinking. Rationalism is predicated on this ideal of Cartesian thought, that for something to be recognized as real, it has to be clear and distinct. An idea has to be clearly and distinctly perceived, clearly and distinctly represented. Now, I want you to read this quotation on the right by Edmund Burke, written in a book that I think is the book that turns the Enlightenment inside out. It's called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas Concerning the Sublime and the Beautiful. So it's the first really extended treatise that tries to assess the essence of the sublime as an aesthetic category and as a form of human experience. And his language in the bold is not coincidental. He says, hardly anything can strike the mind with greatness which does not make some, I can't read all those words in the corner, some kind of approach towards infinity, which nothing can do while we are able to perceive its bounds, but to see an object distinctly and to perceive its bounds is one and the same thing. A clear idea is therefore another name for a little idea. Now, I hope you can see that what he is effectively doing here is he is challenging head on, face to face, very directly and very explicitly, the authority of Cartesian rationality. He's saying that the whole project is doomed to a kind of littleness because nothing that is clear and distinct has the power to move us. And so what Burke is offering here is a kind of definition of the preconditions of that aesthetic category that will come to be called the sublime. It has to be powerful, it has to be moving, it has to be overwhelming, and it has to exceed the capacity of our minds to grasp it, comprehend, make sense of it, and domesticate it. And so now what I'm going to attempt is to show how Wordsworth turns that into his own project. So here's my definition, or at least characterization, of Romanticism. I think Romanticism represents the particular historical moment when secularism appropriated religious mystification as its own ideal. And I think this is immediately apparent in the great art of the Romantic period. Just to show you a very few examples, this is Caspar David Friedrich, the greatest Romantic painter in Germany. And what you can notice, look at the upper left and lower left paintings in particular, he's almost hitting you over the head with his precise strategy, which is to kind of segue from religion to nature, from the church to the creation as the source of our experience of the sublime. And so you find these kind of patent juxtapositions of crosses and abbeys and church ruins with scenes of nature. J.M.W. Turner, the greatest painter, I think, Romantic painter in England from this same era. And just to give you a kind of point of contrast, Poussin, the great French neoclassicist, in the upper left-hand corner, Turner in the lower right-hand corner. So here you can see visually kind of the shift that we have taken from seeing nature as something that is completely under human control. We can organize it, control it, domesticate it, impose our form and will on it, to Turner's apprehension of nature as something that, in spite of our best efforts, is always going to outpace our capacity to control it and to domesticate it, because there is something sublime about nature that is always going to transcend human efforts to control and capture it. So how does Wordsworth render the equivalent of these paintings in poetry? Well, I'm going to give one example here that comes from his Prelude. His Prelude is part of his magnum opus. Wordsworth was an incredibly ambitious poet. He believed that he was divinely called, that he had been foreordained to carry off successfully what John Milton only attempted, but couldn't quite pull off. His greatest project was to write a 4-part autobiography. He completed only the introduction, called the Prelude, which is thousands of lines, and the second part, the Excursion, which is thousands of lines. Helps you understand why people like Lord Byron referred to Wordsworth as William Wordsworth. But if you look at the subtitle, Growth of a Poet's Mind, what's really novel about Wordsworth is that his real focus as a poet is not the external world, although that's the impression, and that's, I think, how many high school English teachers teach Romanticism. It's all about nature, about appreciation of nature. I'm going to show you here how that's just an excuse. He's really more interested in how we as individuals respond to the sublimity in nature. And in writing this monstrously long autobiographical poem, his real project is transparent here in the subtitle. He's really trying to answer the question, how did I become God's greatest gift to the world of poetry? So it's an interesting autobiography insofar as he's not just randomly accumulating memories. What he's trying to discern in his own kind of storehouse of memories is, what are those experiences that were pivotal in making me the individual that I am? And so that makes reading his Prelude much more fun and much more interesting, because you know that in every case, these aren't random moments from the past, but he thinks they are the key to understanding his poetic sensibility. So this is the earliest memory that he narrates in his autobiography. He's a young boy, doesn't give us the age, but you have the impression he's maybe 8 or 10. And if you don't mind, I'll read through this with you and then talk about what's transpiring in this poem that is really so remarkable. One evening, surely I was led by her, and here we get the first clue to something constitutive of the secular sublime, because who's the her that he's being led by? In any other age, it would have been God, the Holy Ghost, the Spirit, but in this case, it's nature. Led by her, I went alone into a shepherd's boat, a skiff that to a willow tree was tied within a rocky cave, its usual home. No sooner had I sight of this small skiff, discovered thus by unexpected chance, than I unloosed her tether and embarked. The moon was up. The lake was shining clear among the hoary mountains. From the shore I pushed and struck the oars and struck again in cadence, and my little boat moved on, even like a man who walks with a stately step, though bent on speed. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. Nathan, can I hear your voice if you speak? Can you read those next couple of lines? Because I can't see them.
Sure. And troubled pleasure, not without the voice of mountain echoes, did my boat move on.
Thank you. Leaving behind her still on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. A rocky steep uprose above the cavern of the willow tree. Now, if I had a blackboard, I would love to draw what he is seeing as he sees it. You need to really employ your visual faculties if you're going to experience the profound power of nature that he's about to describe. So far it just sounds like this kind of idyllic little excursion, a little bit of joy riding, right? He steals this boat, it's late in the evening, maybe night, and he's rowing away. Also, if you've ever rowed a boat, it's important you keep in mind which way are you facing when you row. You are rowing blindly, right? You are rowing into the distance behind you. A rocky steep uprose above the cavern of the willow tree. So looking straight ahead, above his point of departure, he sees this mountain peak. And it rises up. Now, why does it rise up? Much of what unfolds in the next few lines it's an optical illusion that has to do with perspective. As his line of sight changes, because he's going further and further away, more and more of the mountain is going to reveal itself. So a rocky steep uprose above the cavern of the willow tree, and now, as suited one who proudly rode with his best skill, I fixed a steady view upon the top of that same craggy ridge, the bound of the horizon. For behind, in his other direction, was nothing but the stars and the gray sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When, from behind that craggy steep, till then the bound of the horizon, a huge cliff, as with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the huge cliff rose up between me and the stars, and still with measured motion like a living thing strode after me. So do you get what's happened? The farther and the harder he rose, the taller the mountain in the distant rises. So how are you going to experience this as a 10-year-old child who has just stolen a boat? With trembling hands, I turned. Now, what does he have to do? He has to turn into the mountain that is threatening him and steal his way back to the cavern of the willow tree. There in her mooring place, I left my bark and through the meadows homeward went with something and serious thought.
Grave and
serious thank you, grave and serious thoughts. And after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. In my thoughts, there was a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion, no familiar shapes of hourly objects, images of trees or of sky, sea or sky, no colors of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men moved slowly through the mind by day and were the trouble of my dreams. Isn't that marvelous? So why does he pick this as the very first memory that shaped his poetic sensibility? What has he learned here? He's learned that nature is animated by a kind of intelligence, and it's a moral intelligence. It rebels at his violation of moral law. And he senses that nature is this living thing that, again, functions very much like a divinity insofar as it not only infuses the world with beauty and power and glory and majesty, but insofar as it very particularly responds to him as a moral agent with moral judgment. And so this is what qualifies him or attunes him at a very early age to be sensitive to this aspect of nature to which most people are oblivious. So it's not about counting the petals on the tulip. That's not what his relationship to nature is constituted by. Now, I want to shift here because what happens in Wordsworth, and it's already evident, I think, in embryo there, is that Wordsworth is going to move in the direction of a human sublime. And this is what I think most readers and many professors of Romanticism, I think, might miss this in their preoccupation with how he reconfigures ways in which we depict nature. Because even when we think he's talking about nature, he's usually talking about something sublime in the human spirit. So let me give, again, a little bit of background to explain how this becomes possible. If we look at the status of human nature, which in its raw form would be most evident in the child, right? Before the child has been socialized, exposed to civilization, or indoctrinated, we get human nature in its pure, unsullied form. And what status does that have? According to the church, according to Augustine, the only innocent feature in babies is the weakness of their frames. The minds of infants are far from innocent.
Hey, Terryl, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's relevant to what you're saying. It's from David Stout. And I think it pertains to, when he's talking about the boat, he asks, is the moral element the fact that he stole the boat? Is that what the cliff is responding to, the dark, threatening?
Yeah, I think it is. That it's a projection of his own guilt, but he takes that literally. It's not, for Shakespeare, we can go back to Shakespeare, right? King Lear, the heath scene where nature revolts, right? At the moral trespasses being committed far and wide. That's like symbolism. Now here, Wordsworth knows he has stolen the boat. He feels guilty about it. And that guilt is amplified because he sees that nature is aware. That's why I say nature for him has a consciousness. And he refers to it as the spirit that is in nature. On your own, you want to read an even better example where it's much more powerful, much more graphic, read Nutting by Wordsworth, much shorter poem. But again, you see that he is caught by nature in the act of violating a grove of nut trees. And it's really a stark and powerful poem because he knows that he has been caught, judged, and condemned by nature, by the natural world, for violating its sanctity.
So nature has a sort of teaching function.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, he refers to nature as his teacher again and again and again in his autobiographical work. Yeah.
I wonder how much of the world that we conceive of today is shaped by Wordsworth.
Well, that's where,
that's a long
and thank you, because this now allows me to come back to the second slide where I said, how did we get from saying I'm religious to saying, well, I teach a lot of religion classes at the university. I did at the University of Richmond. And I almost always start my religion classes by saying, how many of you consider yourself religious? And typically I'd get 1-2 students, right? Because it's in the South. So you get a couple of evangelicals. And I'd say, how many of you consider yourself spiritual? Every hand goes up, right? Every hand goes up. Folks, that would have been an absurdity. That would have been a meaningless, weird, incomprehensible gesture before about 1800.
Weird because it seems like not a very sound dichotomy.
Yeah, exactly. The two have to be interchangeable, interconnected, and synonymous because our access to God is always mediated, for a Catholic, it's always mediated through the church. It's absurd to think there's any other way of finding access to God. It's mediated by the church, the priests, the clergy, the priesthood, the sacraments. When you get to the evangelicals, to the Protestants, it's mediated by the Bible. And because that becomes the source of authority through which you hear the word and find God. But the notion that you can just disregard these forms and have access to something ineffable and transcendent and divine, well, that's the road that the Romantics pave. And that's precisely what Wordsworth is doing here, right? No religion forms, no institutions, no creedal formulations, just you and nature and an experience of a moral, right? A kind of moral consciousness that can guide and lead and direct and judge and inspire. And so that's why today, when we say, well, I don't go to church, but I like to go to the woods and commune with God. That's a Romantic invention.
And perhaps one of the differences, and you can answer this, is it seems to me that Wordsworth's natural sublime has shades of some threatening shades, almost some a little bit dark, looming shade of.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because the experience
now,
that he chronicles in that poem, he's left terrified for days. And that's what he says. His dreams are haunted. So it has that same kind of Freudian superego father figure function, but it's coming from the woods, the mountains, rather than coming from an Old Testament God. But yeah, there's definitely a dark, somber, moral, kind of threatening undercurrent to Wordsworth. Okay, so back to the transformation then of what's happening to how do we develop a human sublime? Well, you can hardly find a human sublime in the Catholic or Protestant traditions, right? Because Augustine has defined human nature as up oval, from the egg, from the beginning, corrupt, defiled, evil. Calvin is just, right, Augustine on crack. Even infants bear their condemnation with them from their mother's womb. Indeed, their whole nature is a seed of sin, thus it cannot but be hateful and abominable to God. And then a secular version of this, right? Thomas Hobbes, the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay? So the only difference between infants and people is not that they're innocent, it's just that they're littler criminals. But there's nothing in human nature evocative of the divine, right? Prima facie. Now, when does the revolution occur? It occurs, the most probably notable influential figure in this regard is going to be Rousseau, who is it's funny, everybody wants to claim him as their father. The socialists do, the Marxists do, the liberals do. But this is an emblematic statement of an obvious paradigm shift that has occurred. Born with a feeling and virtuous heart, carrying pity and commiseration even to weakness, my soul exulting in every act of generosity, I was humane, benevolent, and charitable from inclination. I have only innocent inclinations. Okay? It would have been patently impossible for him to make those claims or write those words in a medieval period or early Reformation era, or right? I mean, he would have been censored, laughed to scorn, or suppressed.
So is Rousseau writing in?
Pardon?
Sorry, Rousseau's writing in what, 1760?
Yeah, 1760s, through the late 1700s.
Okay.
And so it's at the high point of the Enlightenment. So it's as if the Enlightenment has cleared the way by diminishing, right, the hegemony of the Christian church. And in that space, a new paradigm, a new understanding of human nature can enter. And it does. It does. So that's the beginning of the liberal tradition. Goethe, in his formulation, misunderstandings and neglect occasion more mischief in the world than even malice and wickedness. At all events, the two latter are of less frequent occurrence. So on this foundation, Wordsworth is going to build not just a more benevolent human nature, but a human nature that is divine on its own terms, and not merely because it's in God's image. Okay, so let's look to see evidences of this in Lyrical Balance. This was the collection of poems that introduced Romantic poetry to the English-speaking world. 1798, Lyrical Balance. He co-wrote it with Coleridge. This is probably the most successful poem in that collection, 1798, and it's called Tintern Abbey. And this is how it begins. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again, I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with soft inland murmur. Once again, do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again, I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms, green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees, with some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. Okay, if you don't mind, we're going to spend some time on these couple of stanzas, because upon close analysis, they turn out to reveal something very, very different at work here than what we presumed to be a simple depiction of nature. First of all, I could take you back to the title. The actual title isn't Tintern Abbey. The actual title is Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey. What's the difference between those two titles? I wish I had a live audience I could interact with, because I'd see who gets it first. But notice that Tintern Abbey creates the impression that this is about something we're seeing in nature. Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey takes us in a very different direction. Oh, this is about an act of composing, which means it's really about a composer writing lines, right? Now, next thing I want you to notice is a definite movement. Imagine that you're a filmmaker, you're running the camera, and you're kind of tracking his description as we go through these lines. Where do you start? Well, he starts with these mountain springs in the distance, steep and lofty cliffs in the distance. And then where do we go? They connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose where? Here, under this dark sycamore. So this is very, very deliberate. We've gone from the expansive, the panoramic, to the mediate, to the proximate. Can you go any further than the proximate? Yes. How does he move us in the next stanza? Now he has to do it imagistically, equating his retreat into the self to dwellers in houseless woods or hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. See what's happening here? He is deliberately moving us toward more and more and more intense interiority. This has nothing to do with nature. This is about the retreat into the self and what we're going to find in the self. You want further evidence of that? Look at the verbs in this poem. What do the verbs refer to? Birds flying, water bubbling, wind blowing? No. What verbs do you find? I repose, I see, I hear. They're all verbs of him interacting and responding to this world. Let's take it a little further. These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye. In other words, he doesn't depend on proximity to respond to these things, right? So he's talking about a kind of imaginative self-sufficiency. I don't even have to see these things. But oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restorations. Feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little nameless unremembered acts of kindness and of love, nor less I trust to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on, until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. What's just happened here? What's just happened? He has achieved the kind of mystical union with the divine that we generally associate with poetry of the great Catholic mystics. Notice that he's even snuck in biblical resonances, right? That we become a living soul. But here again, notice how powerful this move is, because it isn't God that has breathed the breath of life and created a living soul. It is he, the sensitive poet, that in responding to nature in the appropriate way becomes a living soul and sees not the beatific vision of God, but into the life of things, the creation generally. See what I mean about a kind of self-sufficiency that we find within ourselves as almost gods in embryo, but not in any Christological sense. We just have this innate capacity to unite with the most divine transcendent aspects of the natural world. So,
hey, Terryl, would you also call that a transition from the visible to the invisible?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that again is another reason why these poets aren't poets writing about nature. In fact, it almost becomes comical if you look at his attempts to describe nature. They're flat, they're featureless, they're completely imprecise. Cliffs, what kind of cliffs are they? Steep and lofty cliffs. Well, I'm glad, because otherwise I might have thought it was a short, stubby cliff, right? How many shades of green? Oh, everything's just green. See, he's almost deliberately thwarting our efforts to see, because he's saying, no, it's not about that. It's not about that. It's about something else in here. Yeah, the invisible. Yeah. Okay, Intimations Ode. Excuse me. This is a very famous poem, more famous to Latter-day Saints because of its clear references to the premortal life. But this becomes a really, really good example in concentrated form of a secular Bible. Because think about the title, Ode on Intimations of Immortality. So he's here addressing one of the most perennial themes in Western literature, which is, how do I confront my mortality? How do I console myself for my finitude and the limitations of a human life? So this is how the poem starts. There was a time when meadow grove and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoever I may by night or day, the things which I have seen I now can see no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. The moon doth with delight look round her when the heavens are bare. Waters on a starry night are beautiful and fair. The sunshine is a glorious birth. But yet I know, where'er I go, that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Who does this sound like? If you don't get that this clearly sounds like Adam and Eve after they've been kicked out of the garden, then you're not reading your Bible. This is a poem about the loss of innocence, right? The earth used to be shrouded in celestial. Notice he doesn't mention God, but all the equivalents, right? Glorious, celestial, freshness. And yet it's not there anymore. Except for him, Eden is not a biblical locale. It's the age of childhood. And again, you can see how counter this is to the Calvinist kind of, here for Wordsworth, the child now has become the absolute embodiment of innocence. But there's a tree of many one, a single field which I have looked upon. Both of them speak of something that is gone. Pansy at my feet doth the same tale repeat. Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? So how do I recapture that innocence and that proximity to heaven? And then it just comes to him. There's this abrupt intrusion. It's as if he experiences it as a vision, a visionary kind of recollection is what he's going to call it. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life star, hath elsewhere its setting and cometh from afar. not in entire forgetfulness and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. Now, if you know anything about paradigm shifts and Thomas Kuhn and structure of scientific revolutions, anytime you demolish a paradigm, you've got to replace it with a paradigm that is more effective in answering the questions the first one failed to. So if we have largely abandoned Christianity, as most of the intellectuals and romantics of the period do, that leaves us with all kinds of questions we have to find other answers to. And the answer that most haunts Wordsworth is, why this sadness? The world is beautiful. There are sunsets and flowers and alpine meadows. And why am I sad? What have I lost? And this is his answer. In this new paradigm, notice what he's doing with immortality. Instead of saying, don't worry, you'll live again, he's saying, no, I've got a more powerful explanation. You lived before. And the proof of a paradigm is its ability to make sense of the perplexing. So let's see how he does that. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Well, we all remember that. Who wouldn't want to go back to their childhood? But shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. But he beholds the light whence it flows. He sees it in his joy. The youth, who daily farther from the east must travel, still is nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. At length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. So if I had time, we'd go through the whole ode. It's about 6 or 8 times this long, because step by step, he makes new sense out of everything about human life in light of a pre-existence. So what is the function of a parent or a nursemaid in this new paradigm? He tells us it's to help us forget the glory we used to know and console us in our loss. And as we go through the stages of life, we're just acting out different parts because we have lost our sense of who we really are, which is eternal beings. Okay? So this again is what I mean by a secular Bible. He's given us a completely new paradigm for understanding where we come from, our nature, our wants, our hurts, our desires. Yeah, Nathan.
This is a good spot to ask a question from Garrett Maxwell. He asks, what will the poems be about once we've effectively wiped out nature, when sublimity goes extinct?
I'm not sure if you mean what will happen in the present from here on out or what happened then. For the Romantics, nature is always going to serve the purpose of being a catalyst to our response. So for the Romantic poet, and you know, this is what really I love about Wordsworth, is all of his poetry is about different encounters. Westminster Bridge, this great poem about I'm walking across the bridge one morning and suddenly I'm astounded at this beauty of the London cityscape, which I've never seen before. So it's all about our sensibility. In fact, the favorite metaphor of Romantic poets for the poetic soul was the Aeolian harp, which is like a wind chime, kind of like a wind chime. So it's all about, we measure our poetic gifts by our susceptibility to nature. So whereas Descartes wanted to emphasize the strict dichotomy between thinking self and world, for the Romantics, no, we're fully integrated into that. We strive to achieve a harmony, to be part of it. So nature is indispensable in serving as that catalyst and that litmus test for our own sensibility. And
even when the nature that we imagine now to be maybe a little bit more complete as a concept, I think Garrett's question is imagining it kind of falling away from that completeness, and maybe that's happening now. How do we, use nature to find out the divine within us if it has become so thoroughly, corrupted?
Well, yeah, it's no coincidence that the great environmentalists are all from, environmentalism as a phenomenon appears for the first time in Romanticism. There is, like Wordsworth, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, all right. For him, we have commercialized, exploited, misappropriated the natural world. So they raise the alarm. Many of Turner's paintings are about that theme, his fear that industrialization in the steam age is eclipsing a more natural world appreciated and reverenced by humans. So there's no question that they sense the impending crisis of a kind of exploitation and domination of the natural world. And they don't offer any solution other than a cry for a more sensitive, compassionate, humane response to the natural world. You know, this theme is everywhere. Right? Think of Bobby Burns in his famous poem "To a Mouse," right? He's even upset that he's disturbed this little mouse, and he says, "I've broken nature's communion," right? So that sensitivity is everywhere there. Okay.
Right.
Now, I want to focus a little bit on the ending of this poem, because this is, I think, the single greatest testament of liberal humanism in the English language. English or liberal humanism, a vaguely defined kind of ideology according to which the supreme force in the universe is the will, the power of will, that we can triumph over any odds or any environment. Viktor Frankl, in his Man's Search for Meaning, gives it a much later expression when he repeats Immanuel Kant's argument that we always have the power to respond in any way that we choose. And that actually becomes, in Kant, a function of the dynamic sublime. So that word is actually associated with this power of the human spirit. So I want you to see something very, very surprising that happens here. So Wordsworth ends his poem, and he's still sad because he's further away from that source of divine light from which he came as a spirit. And there's no way of recapturing that direct immediacy with heaven. But here's his consolation. The thought of our past years in me doth breed perpetual benediction, not indeed for that which is most worthy to be blessed, delight and liberty, the simple creed of childhood, whether busy or at rest, with new-fledged hope still fluttering in his breast. Not for these I raise the song of thanks and praise, okay? In other words, he's going to upset all your expectations. He's saying, my consolation is not, all those happy memories of innocent, joyful childhood. No. But for those obstinate questionings of sense and outward things, fallings from us, vanishings, blank misgivings of a creature moving about in worlds not realized, high instincts before which our mortal nature did tremble like a guilty thing surprised, kind of evoking his childhood experience. But for those first affections, those shadowy recollections, which be they what they may, are yet the fountain light of all our day, are yet a master light of all our seeing. Have you captured the essence of what he's saying here? I really, I just find this one of the most magnificent expressions of a particular kind of noble heroism. Because what he's saying is, right, it's intimations of immortality. I don't know. I can't prove it. I have no way of verifying it. But it's the uncertainty I celebrate. It's the perplexity that is my goad to striving and to searching. It is the unfinishedness of my human spirit that beckons me upward and onward. And I just find that magnificent. Whereas in every prior generation, we find our consolation in the hope of a future world of bliss and respite from our suffering. And Wordsworth is effectively the first to instead embrace the human condition and say, no, this is what it means to be human. He writes another poem in which he talks about the death of his brother, and he says, a deep distress hath humanized my soul. What makes us human is precisely the fact that we are not at home in this world. Otherwise, we'd be no different from the cattle grazing in the field. So I find this a really magnificent finale. Okay, I'm going to go back to the prelude now for one more glimpse into, again, this, what I call this human sublime. And this is very early on as he's framing the project of his autobiography. And listen to this, because I think this is just amazingly profound. The mind of man is framed even like the breath and harmony of music. There's a dark, invisible workmanship that reconciles discordant elements and makes them move in one society. Ah, me, that all the terrors, all the early miseries, regrets, vexations, lassitudes, that all the thoughts and feelings which have been infused into my mind should ever have made up the calm existence that is mine when I am worthy of myself. Praise to the end. Isn't that magnificent? What he's saying is, how come we are not just this chaos of memory, sensation, trauma, instinct, right? I mean, we are all, our minds are peopled by a million episodes of hurt, surprise, wonder, comfort, love, hate, conflict. And yet what happens? Somehow they all coalesce into this identity that is the calm self in a moment of introspection. Isn't that lovely? I mean, in some ways, he's taken the most banal fact of our life, which is that we are effectively constituted as singular human identities, and ascribed to it a miraculous character, that we find this coherence and serenity. And I'll end with these because they recapitulate that same theme in his Excursion, which is meant to be his second chapter in his autobiography. "'Tis a thing impossible to frame conceptions equal to the soul's desires, and the most difficult of tasks to keep heights which the soul is competent to gain. Man is of dust, but ethereal hopes are his. From this infirmity of mortal kind, sorrow proceeds. Too contracted are these walls of flesh, unless above himself he can erect himself. How poor a thing is man." What he is saying here is a profoundly religious sentiment, but it's religious in the secularized sense. As Aristotle held, what seems to distinguish the human creature from every other biological entity is that we are capable of self-transcendence. We can become something greater, better, nobler than what we are. And that is both a haunting and an inspiring prospect. I'll just close by drawing this connection between these lines and the earliest religious text known to exist in the West, which is an ancient Babylonian creation story called Atrahasis from about 2 millennia BC. I don't have it here to quote, but in that creation myth, the gods assemble a council and they decide they're just working too hard, and they want to create a race of humans that will be capable of doing the work for them, that will effectively be their slaves and servants. But in order to be capable of doing all that will be demanded of them, it is felt necessary to put into their tabernacles of clay divine spirits. So I think it's the earliest reference to pre-existence in Western thought. So they agree. So they take this divine heavenly spirit and put it into a human made of clay. But with this caution, they say effectively, but we must make them forget where they came from. Because if they know that they have a home in the heavens, that they will be impelled to do whatever it takes to return here. And their aspirations to divinity will upset all of our plans and destabilize our sovereignty. And so we find that from earliest recorded religious texts all the way through the secularization of religion in the Romantic period, we have this same kind of tortured self that has these intimations, a sense of infinite potential and possibilities, but bound within the constraints of this mortal, weak, fleshly vehicle. So the sentiment that underlies both religious aspiration and reverence for the sacred, I think, will continue to persist through whatever different modes of art and literature we invent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terryl. That was very memorable. That was thought-provoking, profound, and I'm sure we'll be ruminating about this for a long time. I just want to say that one thing that caught my eye was how all of these disparate themes of Romanticism, which is like the dim, the threatening, the opaque, the shadow, are also seem to be accompanied by light, hope, some kind of unifying element. And I think you've done that for us tonight.
Thank you.
And I just open this up for questions from all of our viewers. If you have any questions, please send them via the Q&A button. We have one now. So David Stout asks again, to what extent and by what sources would Joseph Smith have been aware of or influenced by Romanticism?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, the notion of a zeitgeist or a spirit of the times is largely discredited. Nobody can get away with invoking those concepts today, although I'm not struggling to get tenure anywhere, so I can be more in that regard. I just think these ideas were everywhere present. I can't find that Joseph Smith was personally versed in any of the great Romantic thinkers of the day. And of course, Romanticism doesn't even manifest in America in quite the same way. Scholars don't even call it Romanticism. Its appearance in America is much later, usually 1840s, 50s, and it's associated with Thoreau and Emerson and called transcendentalism. So it's of a very, very different character. I just think that in general, the Enlightenment had served a therapeutic isn't the right word. It had served a salutary function insofar as it freed Western thinkers to radically reconceptualize religion and God. And I guess I would say that was maybe the most important influence on Joseph Smith, is that he was born with and repeated often his hostility to the notion of any constraints on his thinking. He reminds me of William Blake, who incidentally was born in 1757, again, you know, a turning point. If you could summarize Romanticism in one sentence, the sentence was spoken by both Joseph Smith and William Blake, slightly differently. William Blake said, "Without contraries is no progression." And Joseph Smith, of course, said that by proving contrarieties, right, we find the truth. So that's a general vague answer, but that's the best I can do.
You could go ahead and unshare your screen at this point. Okay. And I actually have some questions, Terryl. Goodness, I actually wrote it down beforehand, if you don't mind me
Sure.
kind of reading it. So in the background of Wordsworth's poetry, there seems to lurk a kind of beautiful but vague presence that unifies and pulls the universe together. Does he imagine this unifying force to be something like the pantheism of Spinoza, the logos of the Greeks, or the providence of deism? Where does he locate that? I don't know if you'd even call it God or not, but
yeah. You know, he's never explicit about that. He just has a profound optimism about the inherent goodness. And so I would say he has faith in a kind of providence. One problem with Wordsworth, I love his poetry. I hate to be critical of those who are dead, but Wordsworth just didn't have the courage of his convictions. And I think it's very sad to see that. For example, his statements about preexistence are clear, unambiguous, right? At one point in his ode, he talks about the preexistent spirit as a power that will not be put by. In other words, we can't deny it. It's so evident. And yet, when he was challenged on his views in pre-existence, he got very defensive and backed away and said, "Oh, I don't really profess those things. I was just playing with ideas." And his excursion, there's a religious bleakness in his excursion. His most famous part of the excursion is called the Ruined Cottage, and it's really his principal engagement with the problem of human suffering. And he paints this portrait of a woman. Her husband goes off to war and is killed. Her first child dies of illness. Her second child dies of neglect. She goes mad from suffering, spends every day praying to God, and in the end dies of despair. And the only consolation we find is, Wordsworth says in a really perverse finale, is, well, we feel pity for her. So that's our consolation. We can feel good about ourselves because we feel pity for her. But he works on this project, right, the excursion, for over 50 years, right? 1798 to 1850. And you can look at the successive versions of the excursion, and he becomes more and more and more Christian Orthodox, till by the end, there are images of the cross and references to God and Christ. So he never found a fully satisfactory substitute for the coherence that Christianity gives to the universe.
And without, any more questions coming in, let me just ask another question. So I'm trying to grasp the sweep of your intellectual history. Let me try to gather it in if I can in some small way. So it seems to me that based on your descriptions, the original kind of evocations of mystery with regard to God's being seem to be a kind of mystery unto, or a complexity unto confusion, or maybe even a complexity unto unclarity or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at the kind of mystery that is celebrated in Romanticism, would it be fair to say that's a kind of mystery that is unto grandeur, unto discovery, unto adventure, something like that? Discovery? I don't know.
Yeah, well, as I said, I think, Edmund Burke is the first theorist of the Sublime. Kant also will write on the Sublime. But in Edmund Burke, what distinguishes the religious sublime of Christianity from the sublime of the Romantics is that for Burke, the most important aspect of emotion is intensity. And he's very clear about that. It doesn't have to be virtuous. It doesn't have to lead us to God or to goodliness or right. It's not love or compassion. In fact, he says the very first emotion of which we're aware is curiosity. And the sublime is that aspect of nature that is capable of eliciting the strongest, most intense reactions from us. And so that's right, very, very unlike the Christian sublime, which I think serves the principal function of intellectual bafflement. So that we just kind of give up in our utter incapacity and open ourselves up to grace or to our kind of abject creatureliness that is contrasted.
There's a sort of feeling of you can be overwhelmed by mystery in a way that is not productive, is not inspiring, but you can also be overwhelmed by mystery in a way that pushes you further on to discovery. And I think that's what Romanticism is.
Yeah, and I think that's what you see in Wordsworth, that that last part I read, where he celebrates, right, the mystery insofar as it is that prod to him. There's no question. So he wants to get behind the mystery rather than reveling in it for its own sake. I just, I'm sure this is a controversial thesis. There are a lot of the religiously orthodox who wouldn't subscribe to that view of Christian theological history, but there's an overwhelming number of scholars of Christianity who are making the same argument in bits and pieces. Several books have come out in the last couple of years arguing that no, God was embodied in early Christian thought. It was a mainstream idea. There wasn't anything ineffable and transcendent about him. The early Christians themselves took much more literally the likeness of Adam to God and Christ to God. Kenneth Kirk, I think, does the best job of chronicling this in his book called The Vision of God, in which he says it really began in late Judaism with their discomfort with a God who was physically like us. And so the Bible was redacted. Other scholars say, yeah, that was what the Deuteronomists were all about, was redacting the Bible and eliminating from the biblical text any of those references that collapse that distance between the human and the divine. So there are a lot of scholars who are coming to the same conclusion, kind of piecemeal, I think.
We have, I think, probably one last question. It's from David Stout. It's kind of a fun question. He says, just for fun, if you have time, have you ever thought of pop culture references like Scooby-Doo, where everything has a natural explanation, and Star Wars, where a mysterious force is capable of destroying a Death Star, the grim expression of technology, as pop culture reflections of the back and forth between Enlightenment and Romantic thought in more modern times?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I think I'm going to step out on a limb here, might show my age, but it seems to me that steampunk might be one of the best examples of the conflation of those two, right? In a really weird and appealing way. That there's this nostalgia for an earlier age of technology, but it's all about the technology. And I guess I would think that would be one interesting pop cultural manifestation where you see these two tendencies actually conflated. That's my best shot.
Well, any last words? I think our time is up. Thank you very much, Terryl. I'll let you give you the last word if you have any.
No, just that I'll just say this. I'll just give kind of my last sales pitch for reading poetry. Nobody goes into a bookstore today and says, hey, do you have any Wordsworth? I'd like to read some Wordsworth. But for Wordsworth, the moral challenge, or I'd really say the ethical challenge of being alive as an adult was how do we get over the feeling of habituation and custom with which we encounter life? I mean, we saw it in that beginning, right, where he starts his ode by saying, I used to just revel in this beautiful world. And now it's just lost its sheen. And Wordsworth came to be convinced, as did most of the Romantic theorists, that that's the function of poetry. So find a good poet and read a good poet, because what it does, it allows you to re-engage the world from a different angle and remove its staleness and give you that childlike immersion in the immediacy of perception once again. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Terryl. I just want to let our viewers know that next week, Thursday, the 29th of October, is actually another lecture in Books and Bridges for the Treasures of World Literature, and it's about the mind of Emily Dickinson. And that will be presented by Mark Matheson of the University of Utah. So we have more poetry and more wonder and more mystery and more profundity. Oh my goodness, we have one more question. Do you mind if I ask it, Terryl?
One last question, sure.
Jan Plum asks, as you study the progress and evolution of man's thoughts in poetry and paintings through the centuries and experience how man seeks answers to life's meaning in different ways as we gain more scientific knowledge, do you personally believe there is a God, or is everything simply man's attempt to explain life's mystery?
Yeah, I personally believe there is a God. And I think that what I love about the Romantics is whether or not they come to a consensus about God. Some of them did. Lord Byron was ambiguous. Chateaubriand was a devout Catholic. But one reason that I love them is that they are not so concerned about what we call the propositional content of religion. They're not trying to get to true ideas or a true understanding. Here's how I would characterize their effort, and this is why I identify with them. They're trying to get to a truer experience. And I think that's something that Christianity too often forgets. That Christianity, belief in God, should be about a way in which we engage the creation in which we are placed. And I think that's what the Romantics were trying to do. So I think they were profoundly religious, just in a non-institutional, non-conventional way.
I love that answer. Thanks. Well, always elevating, always stimulating, always deepening. Terryl, thank you very much. And
Thanks, Nathan.
hope to see you next time.
Okay.